Of course, Iran should not have nuclear bomb. But you, Ashfaq, and I can say Iran should not have a nuclear bomb. Is Israel sitting on massive stockpile of nuclear bomb? Has the authority, the morality to say, oh no, you cannot have a nuclear bomb? Or US, the only country that dropped atom bomb on innocent Japanese? A spectacular ignorance of Americans. They don't even know where Isfahan is. Isfahan is a monumental global treasure. We still remember the coup of 1953 as if it happened, a couple of hours ago.
In 1951, when Mossadegh actually won the election and nationalized the oil infrastructure and the oil companies in Iran, what was that state like at that point in time?
He came back with a vengeance. And the establishment of the secret police, SAVAK, with the help of CIA and Mossad, created a police state. Israel is a garrison state. It just is a depot of military equipment. I understand post-Holocaust anxiety of people to be scared of an idiot like Ahmadinejad who denied Holocaust.
How does it entrench Khomeini's leadership? And then how does it then also lead to the Iran-Iraq war?
Islamic Republic has had not 1 year without being contested by a younger generation demanding their democratic rights. So you put Mahmoud Darwish on one side and Jared Kushner on one side and see what is the fate of civilization.
I'm gonna start us soon. There's this clap thing we have to do so that the technical team knows we started. That's the clap. And okay, 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of UNAPOLOGETIC. My name is Ishfaq Kareem. I'm honored today to be joined again by Hamid Dabashi. Hamid, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Ashfaq. How are you?
Very, very good. Hamid Dabashi is a professor. He does his trade at Columbia University. He's authored more than 20 books, and he's a professor in Iranian studies and comparative literature. That's what it says, but honestly, Hamid's expertise are very broad. He can talk about politics, history, a bunch of things. And Hamid, I'm joining you the weekend after the US bombed the country that you come from. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel terrible, obviously, but not just because United States has joined Israel bombing my homeland, 3 absolutely precious sites. One of them is Isfahan, with the spectacular ignorance of Americans. They don't even know where Isfahan is. Isfahan is a monumental global treasure of art and architecture. Was the capital of the Safavid Empire. Every inch of that precious city is Rome and Paris and New York put together. And these barbarian savages go to, Isfahan, we just bombed Isfahan. They don't even know where Isfahan is. They don't even know what Isfahan means. Meydan Nakhsh Jahani in Isfahan, it was one of the epicenters of philosophy and art and architecture in the 16th century. So listen, I feel, but let me put it this way. I was equally angry when they invaded Afghanistan, when they invaded Iraq, when they invaded Libya. The question, yes, this time is hitting closer home, but I'm just agitated by warmongering. And the pretext of, Iran should not have nuclear bomb. Of course, Iran should not have nuclear bomb. But you, Ashfaq, and I can say Iran should not have a nuclear bomb. Is Israel sitting on massive stockpile of nuclear bomb? Has the authority, the morality to say, oh no, you cannot have a nuclear bomb? Or US, the only country that dropped atom bomb on innocent Japanese? The fact is that Iran, as we talk, does not have a nuclear bomb. But Iran and any other country should not have a nuclear bomb. No country should have these ghastly weapons of mass destruction. But in order to do that, you sit down and talk and negotiate. You negotiate it through the UN, not US. US has absolutely zero moral authority to ask anyone to do anything. That's number one. Israel is still engaged in a genocide in Gaza. And at least one factor in this initiating this new war on the Iranian front is to distract attention from the ongoing genocide in Palestine. So yes, but the thing is, we have to calm down, and we have to think, and we have to read, and we have to write, and we have to counter propaganda, and we have to counter untruth, and that's the best we can.
Okay, so thank you for that, Professor Hamid. Just to give you, I mean, we're going to frame the episode for you and for our viewers. The headline I had in mind for what this episode is going to be is, and I want your feedback on that, is the Shah, the Ayatollahs, and 74 years of American bullshit in Iran. Right, so that I think gives you a good idea of what we the breadth we are hopefully gonna cover in this interview. I was thinking war in Iran, but it doesn't exactly count, because I mean for the Shah's time they weren't really making a war. Now you've kind of gotten a lot off your chest there, and I think a lot of it resonates with not just me but viewers watching this around the world. You wrote an article just published today. The headline of that article is "The Iranian people will never forgive or forget U.S.-Israeli attacks," and I think you've already kind of spoken to why that is. But I just want to read extract from that article. I'm read a few before we actually go back to 1951 and start speaking about the Shah, and kind of frame for the audience just what the relationship between the US and Iran has been like and why it exists like that.
1953, August 1953.
But 51 is when Mossadegh nationalized the...
and when yours truly was born.
There we go. So we're starting at 51, not 53, because we want to start with the nationalization. But we won't start there now. I first just want some more reactions from you on what's currently going on. So you also say in your article, I'm quoting, "The nuclear sites bombed by Israel and the US are the property of the Iranian nation, not the possession of a ruling regime. Iranians own their homeland. This is a simple fact that the genocidal Zionist building a pipe dream on someone else's homeland will never understand." Just give us the context to what you mean by that.
You see, I've always, Ashfaq, had issue with Iran did that, Iran did the other thing. Namely, the state has the exclusive right to claim the entirety of the nation. It does not. The whole idea of nation state is a colonial concoction and is not applicable to our part of the world. And it's not just Iran. Pakistan belongs to Pakistani people, not the ruling junta. Egypt belongs to Egyptian people, not the Egyptian junta. The same is with Iran, but particularly in moments of national crisis and national trauma right now, the ease with which they talk about we bombed Isfahan or we bombed Iraq, etc., and then not only bombing industrial infrastructure, but killing scientific leaders, but also, most importantly, innocent citizens, killing them. And right now, every day I open my news feed, see the picture of a young woman, a child, being mourned by their parents. So my point is that we have to shift the point of emphasis away from the state towards the nation. What is now agitated in Iran, it doesn't matter. It crosses over political divisions. As you know, I can't stand the ruling regime in Iran, but has nothing to do with my position vis-a-vis the ruling regime in Iran. It has to do with a homeland, a nation, almost 95 million human beings that own that country. Every once in a while, they give that sovereignty as a loan to a state, to a ruling regime, to see if they deserve it. If they don't deserve it, doesn't matter. It still belongs to the people, the population, the nation that has given that sovereignty. All of these sites that they are shooting from the science and technology and infrastructure, not just of nuclear technology, every technology. Are you kidding me? This iPhone, do you know the algorithm in the iPhone, the algorithm that you're using in our devices, what the word algorithm mean? Algorithms comes from Al-Khwarizmi. Where was Al-Khwarizmi born and raised? These people are insane, not just illiterate. They have no idea. This is not, and it is. I'm not being a nationalist. If you go to Egypt, the same thing. If you go to Indian subcontinent, the same thing. China, the same thing. You have to understand these are precious homelands and the sites of human civilization. You don't go start bombing them. Those sites belong to the people. The states come and go. 50 years ago, we had the Pahlavis. Now we have the Islamic Republic. 5-10 years down the line, it could be another state. It is entirely irrelevant. No state ever has total claim of legitimacy over any nation. Period.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I want to draw a bit on the history. You said I'm going to quote you one more time from your article. There's one more time after this I'm going to quote you, but it's not in this. It's near the end of the interview, and you kind of have touched on this when you speak about sort of the primitive nature of Western civilization's understanding of anything that's outside of its ambit of Western civilization. But you say again, the eternal, unwavering, and unending hostility of the Iranian people towards Tel Aviv and its backers in Washington is what this military invasion has created. Israel and the US have attacked the homeland of Firdausi, Hafez, and Rumi, all the way down to Nema Jushij and Farrukhzad. These icons will hold this nation together against an invasion by an entity whose luminaries include Theodore Herzl, David Ben-Gurion, Baruch Goldstein, and other rank terrorists. So this is something you've touched upon you've clearly touched upon it already, and you've spoken about this in your work. But what do you think it is about the Western psyche that just thinks, it still looks at everything else outside of its ambit as native and uncivilized and barbaric? What's going on there?
Ashfaq, let me make 2 points. Number one, I am not hostile to Western civilization. It's a magnificent civilization. But as Walter Benjamin said, any sign, any monument to civilization is also at the same time a monument to barbarism. I am a product. You and I are product. The minute we start speaking this magnificent English language, we are the product of Western civilization as well as other civilizations. So this is not against everything. Are you kidding? Plato. Plato is part of our humanity. And I always say, maybe I told you before, if I went to Plato and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Plato, I'm Hamid Dabashi, I'm an Iranian." He may not like me because of the Greco-Persian wars, but he knows who I am. But if Heidegger and Derrida went to Plato and said, we come from Germany and France, he wouldn't know where they're coming from. So we have to have a different geography. The reason I say Iranians would never, ever forgive or forget, it has to do with the nature of our historical memory. We still remember Alexander invasion of 4th century BC as if it happened the day before yesterday. We still remember the Mongol invasion. We still remember the coup of 1953 as if it happened, a couple of hours ago. We have a different kind of historical memory. This is why I invoke Ferdowsi, Hafez, Saadi, etc. And my point is, when you have a European settler colony that has moved and come and occupied another people's homeland, they never understand this because they are nothing but a garrison state. Israel is a garrison state. It just is a depot of military equipment. That's all they are. They don't understand what Egypt means to Egyptians, what Iran means to Iranians, what India means to Indians, what China means to the Chinese. They have no conception of it. The other day, somebody was interviewing this rank charlatan, Ted Cruz, quote unquote senator, and they simply asked him, what is the population of Iran? The idiot doesn't even have a notion. They can't even point to Iran on a map, let alone understand what these countries mean. Now, there are Iranians who, for varieties of reasons, have immigrated to Israel. They can write articles. They can tell other Israelis, you don't go near that land. You don't go near the sanctity of that land. If you are, and I would even go so far, Ashfaq, and say, I understand post-Holocaust anxiety of people to be scared of an idiot like Ahmadinejad who denied the Holocaust. But in order to prevent Iran from achieving nuclear war, you sit down and negotiate diplomatically. You don't bomb them. Today, I am absolutely convinced There are stronger voices in Iran to go nuclear after these 10 days of bombardment, when they are defenseless. Do you think Israel will dare attack Pakistan? Will dare attack India? Why? Not that they always distract from what they are doing in Palestine by creating enemies in Pakistan, in Iran, in China, any enemy away from Pakistan. But right now, before this event, you had two radically opposing positions in Iran. You had the reformists who were for negotiation, for diplomacy, for supervision of the International Atomic Energy, for signing to NPT. And you had the radicals, the conservatives, who opposed it. But at this point, I have talked to friends, colleagues who are pacifists, and they're telling me, listen, if we had a nuclear bomb, this would not happen. Our innocent citizens would be alive. So the question of nuclear arm has now gone beyond factions and positions, has become something national. Now, I still oppose it. I don't think Iran should go nuclear, nor should any other country. Israel, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, they should all be part of a regional disarmament. You are not in a position when you're sitting on a massive stockpile of nuclear warhead, when you are engaged in a slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinians. You may be delusional. You may be blind. You may not see the way the world sees you. But your prime minister is a criminal running away from the law, from international law. How delusional can you be? You keep creating 100 million other human beings who detest you. Why would you want to do that?
Hamid, I absolutely hear the anger in your voice, and sort of the misunderstanding that the West has on Iran. But I mean, this is a long relationship, and we mentioned in the start that we're going to go back to 1951. And I think the main object of this is to give our viewers who don't understand just the history of the relationship between the U.S. specifically, but the West and Iran, but also to show that the Shah, the Islamic regime, the Ayatollahs who currently run Iran, they have their component of it which is organic to Iran, but they also have a component which was not entirely. And so Iran was a very different country in 1950, post World War II, heading in a very different direction. And we mentioned earlier on, and we're going to speak about the CIA's coup of Mossadegh, but just give us an idea. In 1951, when Mossadegh actually won the election and nationalized the oil infrastructure and the oil companies in Iran, what was that state like at that point in time?
I remember years ago, Economist, a horrid reactionary organ, had a cover of the Middle East, so-called Middle East. I intensely dislike the word Middle East. And the caption said, "What is our oil doing there?" Well, it is not your oil, it's their oil, and it's other thing. But you see, yes, 1951-53, the nationalization of Iranian oil is a pivotal event in modern Iranian history. But so far as the relationship with the U.S. is concerned, I always say, let's push it back. Go to the constitutional revolution of 1906-1911, when two legendary Americans, Howard Baskerville, who was a Christian missionary and went to Iran for his missionary purposes, but soon joined the Iranian constitutional revolution. He was a very young, handsome man, and he lost his life. Howard Baskerville has entered the iconography of Iranian revolutions of the early 20th century. Morgan Schuster was responsible for finances of the revolutionaries at the time. There are no kind of innate hostilities between any people. Why should there be innate hostility between Americans and Iranians? These are manufactured hostilities. And in the course of the coup of 1953, in fact, CIA was persuaded by MI6. Usually the British get away with this. This was a British plot, the mother of all deceptions and colonial thievery was the British colonialism, particularly in India and going back all the way to the 19th century. Jewel of the crown. There's an entire magnificent civilization. What does that have to do with your crown? The hell with your crown, jewel of the crown. So in the course of the nationalization of Iranian oil during the time of Mossadegh, the issue is not just nationalization of Iranian oil. The issue is an eventual possibility of a democratic process, the institutionalization of democracy. When a prime minister, a popular, democratically elected prime minister, is about to control the absolutist monarchy, this was the dream of the constitutional revolution that the late Shah's father, Reza Shah, through yet another colonial intervention by the British, prevented from happening between 1930s and 1940s. And he was flirting with the Nazis and with Hitler as well. When he was deposed and his son was put into in power, then there was collective national attempt to create institutional democracy in the form of parliament and elected officials like the prime minister that would control and contain the absolutist tendencies of the monarch. Shah didn't like that and tried to resist it, and it became a colonial issue when just a few years before Nasser in Egypt, Mossadegh started talking about nationalization of oil. When nationalization of oil happened, which is an Iranian natural resources, this is when the British first, through MI6, and the Americans through CIA, they had an interest, along with Shah, who was striving for his absolutist dreams and delusions, and staged a coup. Shah ran away from Mossadegh's democratic process. They staged a coup. Kermit Roosevelt wrote a book testifying at how he actually arranged it. And there has been, my friend and colleague, Abrahamian has written a detail with the Freedom of Information Act from CIA sources account of the coup of 1953. So the democratic aspirations was aborted, and that remained as a trauma that then in 1953 was reminiscent of the Russo-Persian wars of early 19th century. This is the way the mind of an Iranian works, not just an Iranian scholar, anybody. In fact, Iranian, I used to, in my classes, as soon as I said something, my students say, "Oh, Professor Dabashi, but my father or my grandfather says," they're all opinionated, as they should be. So the coup of 1953 remained a significant knee-jerk reaction in terms of our conception of national sovereignty and national hope and aspiration for both a democratic state against tyranny within the Iranian polity and against foreign intervention. And what is happening, as you know, over the last 40 plus years, Iranians have always, one few years after another few years, are out in the streets demonstrating and demanding their democratic rights, their civil liberties. It is not that Islamic Republic has had an easy walk in the park over the last 40 years, but it's grassroots Iranian desire and aspiration for democracy. And at the same time, the fact is that the ruling Islamic regime has a lot of supporters for their own reasons and their own aspirations. So this is an internal conflict between brothers and sisters. Has nothing to do. There is nothing uglier than Benjamin Netanyahu. I'll come and give you freedom. Who the hell are you? I mean, these people have no conception of themselves and who they are. Yes, we are for democracy. We are for democratic institutions, but it is only meaningful if it comes from within the society. And now Trump is talking about regime change. What kind of regime change? The only regime change, Ashfaq, that will happen if this regime falls is a military coup, is a right wing of the current Islamic Republic organize a coup and becomes even worse in terms of its domestic policies and regional policies. You just have to allow for societies to go through their own course and do their own things. If there are issues such as nuclear energy, nuclear war, as they were doing, Iranians were negotiating in good faith under Obama administration. And Obama administration, which was an American government, agreed. They signed in Paris, and it was a perfectly legitimate operative agreement. And in comes Trump and tears it to pieces. And then comes Biden and he dilly-dallies and does not honor it either. And then comes another Trump. Because now the psychopathology of this is because Obama had a Nobel Prize, he wants to have a Nobel Prize. And then he's a juvenile delinquent. I mean, he's just a bully in a high school courtyard. He doesn't have any consistency of thought of anything. This is what the world has come to. We are at the mercy of these thugs. So he says, okay, let's have negotiations in Oman, in Paris, song and dance. And Iranians are negotiating in good faith. Of course, they will not surrender. They will negotiate. They have something to give, and they give something, but they have to have something in return. But it was all deception. It was all sort of deceiving the Iranians, while he said it himself on the night of the attack, that he and Bibi Netanyahu, as if the whole world has to know what's the nickname of this war criminal, has to be Bibi Netanyahu. I'd like to know what's your original name before you converted it to Anglophone name. We were coordinating. Of course you were coordinating to who what bombs where and what comes after that. These people have, as we say, chutzpah, the audacity, the vulgarity to talk about the world. That is not just Iran, about Syria, about Lebanon, about Palestine. I mean, this is the same man who said, oh yes, we have to empty Gaza and send the Palestinians away, and I will turn it into a Mediterranean thing. This is what you call it, Abraham Accord. That's his real estate son-in-law, Jared Kushner. This is the way they see the world. It is, you go talk to a Palestinian and the significance of Gaza. They think of, if you want to know how a Palestinian thinks of Palestine, read Mahmoud Darwish's poetry. So you put Mahmoud Darwish on one side and Jared Kushner on one side and see what is the fate of civilization. What is the fate of our humanity? That you want to bulldoze the entirety of Gaza and turn it into what? Mar-a-Lago? So the issue, we have to constantly move in the region in order to understand it is not just Iran, it's Lebanon, it's Syria, is Palestine, is the entirety of the region, that people are entitled to their safety, to their humanity. It has nothing to do with Jews having a homeland. Jews have always had a homeland in Palestine. Jews should always have a homeland in Palestine, and they should have a homeland anywhere else. Indian Jews are Indian. Iranian Jews are Iranian. American Jews are American. This is why I have said Muslims have to be on the forefront of battling anti-Semitism everywhere and anywhere. It's a horrid, ghastly act of racism. But to put all Jews, no, you have to have a Jewish homeland, I'm as opposed to an Islamic Republic of Palestine as I am to a Jewish state of Palestine, or Israel as they call it. These regions have always, fortunately, happily, be multi-ethnic, multicultural. I mean, look at the Qubbat al-Sakhra and the Wailing Wall, and look at how Christianity and Islam, I've been there. I've visited Haram al-Sharif. I've prayed on Haram al-Sharif when the Israeli soldiers attacked us. If you look at the structure and the architecture of the Holy Land, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are interwoven. There must have been a divine reason that all of these are connected to each other. You take one brick out, the whole system collapses. No religion has an exclusive claim. Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Give us a break, for God's sake. We're humans, and we are humans living in a very fragile period in Earth history. The world is coming we cannot breathe. The air is polluted. They try to control the southern borders with Mexico. There is a fire in the woods, in jungles in Canada, and is polluting. Here in New York, even we can't breathe. You want to put send an ice to Canada to prevent the smoke coming from the thing? I mean, there is somebody has, and then he has cut all the budgets for environmental safety. These are the people. 72 million Americans voted for this thug. Not that the other one was any better than this, but ask me next question, Ashraf.
No. I mean, I let you. I mean, you definitely were weird, of course, but I think it was all very necessary. So I let you do that. Okay, I'm coming back to the Shah now, and you mentioned how. Really, the thing that was important that was derailed by the coup was the process of democracy in Iran, and that natural feeling, which really started with the constitutional crisis, like sort of 30 or 40 years before then, and that you kind of gave a brief history that momentum to the Shah had been building up long before the coup, long before World War II. But now, just tell us, let's take us back to that moment post coup, right? And the Shah is reinstalled or takes power himself. What is his rule like? And what does it do to Iranian democracy? And what gets born out of resistance to the Shah?
Soon after he was reinstalled, after the coup of 1953, he came back with a vengeance. And the establishment of the secret police, SAVAK, with the help of CIA and Mossad, created a police state. And I am the product of that period. I had no illusion of democracy. In fact, to tell you the truth, in my most recent book, I wrote, not having an illusion, for much of my life, I had illusion of democracy. And India, the largest democracy, and look what happened with BJP and the Hindu fundamentalism. United States, oldest democracy. What democracy? Look at what is happening. Look at this pathetic two-party system. But between 1953, as I have told you before, I was born 1951, just celebrated my birthday, June 15th, a few days ago. The condition in Iran is absolutist monarchy. We initially had two-party system, Hezb Mardom, People's Party, and Iran and Novin, the New Iran, etc. But soon he did away with that and created one party. He called it Hezb Rastaqis, the party of resurrection. And it became an authoritarian regime. All institutions of democracy, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of publications, all disappeared. It was an authoritarian system. And there was no possibility of anything that could happen, and in terms of political participation. And in fact, one way of reading the Iranian Revolution of 77-79, that why it assumed such a overwhelmingly religious Islamist Shi'i dimension, was that the mosques and Shi'i establishment were the only possibilities of gathering among Iranians, and as a result, they became increasingly politicized, and they were more powerful and more effective than, say, the nationalist or the socialist parties. The Tudeh party, which was active in 40s, was banned. Mossadegh, as a champion of Iranian nationalism, of course, was deposed and died in exile. So in the absence of a nationalist political agenda, anti-colonial nationalist political agenda, and in the absence of a profoundly socialist element, democratic socialism, that has always been, since the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, definitive to Iranian political culture, Islamism, unfortunately, became the single most important defining factor of political opposition. Now, if you look at between, say, the initial attempt of Khomeini to topple the Shah in June 1963 and the 1977-79 revolution, at that period, at least historically, discursively, ideologically, we are aware of anti-colonial nationalism. We don't have a political party. We are aware of democratic socialism. We don't have a party. As a result, the generation of Islamist ideologues like Jalal al-Ahmad, whom I have written, or Ali Shariati, they had a dialogical prose, Ashfaq. When they were writing, contesting, and debating with anti-colonial nationalism and democratic socialism. But in the aftermath of the success of the Islamist revolution, which happened during the 444 days of the American hostage crisis, that polyvocal polity disappeared and became monological and resulted in Islamist ruling regime. But from 1979, that the Islamic Republic was established, until just 2 years ago, when you had Zan Zindagi Azadi uprising, Islamic Republic has had not 1 year without being contested by a younger generation demanding their democratic rights. And they are not all the same. If you have Khatami as a president, is a different story than you have Raisi as the president. But these people don't care, don't understand, don't want to know. So the moral of the story is this: after coup of 1953, until the Iranian Revolution of 77-79, you have absolutist authoritarian rule, but in film, fiction, political thinking, there are events happening that enrich and empower and diversify Iranian political discourse. Come the revolution, all of them come to the open and contest, but Islamists are the only one with guns in their hands and determination to turn the entire revolution into a monolithic revolution. Then the hostage crisis happened, and for 444 days, while the world attention is on the American hostages, they consolidate their powers. Now, why were the hostages taken? I have written extensively against hostage taking, but the fact is, in 1977-79, revolutionary Iranians had every reason to believe that the CIA will repeat the coup of 1953. General Heuser at the time, under President Carter, was in Iran. They were plotting for yet another repetition of the coup of 1953. So that trauma did not exactly disappear, was always already there. And the rhetorical that now the Zionists tell Trump, oh, they keep saying death to America. Death to America is a silly death to nobody. I mean, they don't know. There is a generation of thinkers and scholars and novelists who have opposed the slogan of death to America. They said, let's say shame to America, not death to America. But they don't care. They don't want to know the complexity of a political culture. So growing up in that period, going back to your original question, is a period of gestation of democratic hopes and aspirations that coagulate in the course of the 77-79 revolution. And for about 2 years, you have an effervescence of these ideals and aspirations in political participation, in demonstrations. I was there. I was in Tehran University, on Tehran University campus. Personally, I have written. I just finished a book on Iran of 1970s. But who reads? These people don't read. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm preaching to the choir. Of course you read. And so are all your listeners, all your people who follow you. But we have no choice but to remain constantly vigilant and talk about facts, about history, about diversity of opinions, etc.
Okay, thanks. It was a fantastic sort of overlook, specifically in sort of the consistent evolution of what happens post 1953. But I just want to hone in a little bit on what life and specifically what suppression was like under the Shah, and also how he was consistently propped up by the US regime, because I think that relationship's important. And then after that, just because I know, I mean, it's fine, you can, please feel free to go in whatever direction you like and skip ahead if you want as well. But after that, I want to speak about the Iran-Iraq war and how the US, again, there played a very destructive role. And really was almost entirely a war that was maybe caused and armed and continued by them. But just so what was suppression like under the Shah? I think that's important for us to understand. And then after that, we'll start speaking about the Islamic regime itself and what that's been like.
The suppression was in the form of severe censorship in every aspect of our life. Political participation, intellectual productions, film, fiction, etc., that people had to resort to symbolic language. People had to resort to symbolic poetry. If you look at our poets, if you look at our filmmakers, if you look at our novelists, the way that they used we are talking about 1953 and 1963. This decade is very important. 53, the coup happens. 1963, Ayatollah Khomeini has his first attempt at toppling the regime. He fails, but 1953 and 1963, you have an effervescence of art, of culture, of literature, of poetry, of film, of fiction, in which democratic aspirations, because of censorship, because of repression, assume artistic manifestations. So we grew up in that generation, 1963. For example, we'll say the poetry of the poet you just mentioned, Farrokh. In that poetry, there are phenomenal things that are happening. First and foremost, about women's rights, women's liberation, in a way that you have to go around the region. For example, look at Fatima Mernissi, look at Asya Jabbar, look at N.G. Aflatun in the neighboring countries to understand the significance of a poet like Farrokh. She was also extremely political and revolutionary in her own politics. But she's not alone. You go to another poet, Ahmad Shamlou is the same thing, Mehdi Akhavan Saleh is the same thing. The point is that if you go beyond 1963, let's say 1953 to 1973, 20 years, we don't have any political participation. So far as Shah is concerned, because of the Arab oil embargo of 1973, in 1973, the Iranian revenue from oil skyrocketed, and Shah was suddenly in possession of this extraordinary wealth that he thought he can do whatever he wants. There was rampant corruption in the Pahlavi court. For example, if there was a project to build a dam somewhere in Iran, and they would ask for 2 or 3 companies to bid. Then one of these companies will approach the Pahlavi court, particularly his corrupt sister Ashraf Pahlavi, and give them hush money and back money and such, and they will give the project to that person who had given more money to Ashraf. So you have corruption in the royal court. You have massive money that is coming from the oil revenue. Through Kissinger and Rockefeller, some of that oil revenue after 1973 comes back to Pentagon in the building of the so-called AWACS, AWACK. There were these airplanes that I'm sure some of them were now helping Israelis fuel in the air. The original design of this back in the 70s, Shah paid for it. And when the revolution happened, there were a few number of AWACS ordered that were now left after the revolution. So this is the kind of country we have, authoritarian. He had this ridiculous celebration of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, and invited and gave a party to all the other heads of states to prove that he was a descendant of Cyrus the Great. I mean, these are delusions that all of people have in this region. But the point is that he was using it for his own self. There was something of Donald Trump in him, in Pahlavi. Sometimes when I look at Donald Trump, I see the Shah of my teenage years, and I get goosebumps because it just reminds me of the Shah. So you don't have any sort of political participation that is legitimate. We were told every 5 people that we are in a campus, etc., one of us is a member of the Secret Service, which was a joke, but nevertheless paralyzed people. And at the same time, he was subservient to Americans, subservient to the British, and he had their chip on his shoulder because he knew that he had run away. And then, on the other hand, he would create court-sponsored, royal court-sponsored art events in Shiraz and Tehran and such. Some of these events, it is important for us to know. Right now, unfortunately, Farah Pahlavi, his wife, the former queen, is sucked into the stupidities of her son supporting Israel. But during the time of her own era, she was the source of some significant good for her homeland. It is important for us to recognize that. And many artists, many filmmakers, many painters, many poets, she was responsible to make sure through the establishment of something called Kanun Parvarish Fikri to encourage them, finance them, make sure that they can work. So that's the picture that we have until 1977-79, to the point that when I remember I used to go to Ali Shariati's, I was an undergraduate student in Tehran, and a friend of mine who was more religiously oriented took me to a lecture by Ali Shariati, who was emerging as a very important figure. And Islamist discourse was not part of the general understanding of how the politics should work. But nevertheless, he had a huge follower. And then even that following by people like Ali Shariati or Mutahari or Al Ahmad were different from the dogmatism and fixation that Ayatollah Khomeini had. And it is precisely that dogmatism, that fixation, that resulted in the 77-79 revolution, which is a whole different ballgame.
Okay, so I mean, we're gonna get to the war, the Iran-Iraq war, and obviously what precedes that is the hostage crisis. Now you've mentioned that, and you've mentioned how the youth who kind of stormed the embassy had these concerns and these hang-ups over because of what happened to Mossadegh and because of the relationship which you've now explained between the US and Israel. But how does that embassy crisis really how does it entrench Khomeini's leadership, and then how does it then also lead to the Iran-Iraq war?
There are 3 events, Ashraf. One is the American hostage crisis, 1970, November 4th, 1979 to January 4th, 1981, 444 days. That a group of Iranian students took over an American embassy, and initially was a spontaneous act that they did, but soon Ayatollah Khomeini recognized the significance of this. The significance of this was not for what you Americans, at the time I was a graduate student at Penn, it was not what Americans were concerned about their diplomat. The significance of this for Khomeini was to destroy any form of alternative revolutionary imagination and institution and discourse that existed at the time, and consolidate his Islamist version of the revolution. If you look at the first presidential election that took place, the drafting of the constitution and parliamentary elections, they all happened within these 444 days. The voting for, do you agree with an Islamic Republic? Yes, no. There is no other option. Was happening during this period of the hostage crisis. We have very few documents. One of them by the legendary public intellectual Mustafa Rahimi, who wrote a magnificent essay, Why Do I Disagree with an Islamic Republic?, in which you see how Iranians who were for the revolution but against an Islamic Republic were articulating their position. But as I said, the fear and anxiety and trauma of the coup of 1953 was very much present at the time. So one cannot blame them, but the catastrophic consequences of it was for the consolidation of the Islamic Republic. And the hostages were not released yet. The hostages were released in January 1981, when in September 1980, the Iran-Iraq war started, just about 6 months before that, in which war, of course, Kissinger at the time said, because Kissinger, they were all arming both sides, Europeans and Americans were arming both sides. Kissinger infamously said, too bad they can't both lose. In other words, they crafted two bumper zones. I've written about this, two bumper zones. One was Saddam Hussein in the West, one was the Taliban in the East. Saddam Hussein was informed by Arab nationalism. The Taliban in the East were informed by Sunni jihadism. And these two events actually turned the Iranian revolution into an Islamist revolution. Khomeini welcomed them because the cosmopolitan aspect of the Iranian revolution of 77-79 that included within its bosoms democratic socialism and anti-colonial nationalism were eradicated once you had the Taliban from one side and Saddam Hussein from the other side. 8 years of devastating war followed. And the third factor, I said there are three. One was the American hostage crisis. Two was the Iran-Iraq war. Third, are you ready? Was Salman Rushdie affair. When Salman Rushdie wrote his Satanic Verses, again, we had an internal event in Iran that Khomeini had turned against his designated successor, Ayatollah Montazeri. Why did he turn against Montazeri? Because Montazeri opposed mass execution in Iranian prisons. And that angered Ayatollah Khomeini. He dismissed Montazeri, and now he had a crisis of succession, for which reason he ordered a constitutional convention. And for that to happen without global attention, he took advantage of the Salman Rushdie thingamajig. So while the world was distracted by Salman Rushdie affair, he was busy redrafting the constitution in a way that took out the necessity of a learned Shi'i man like Montazeri to succeed him, and allowed for a low-ranking clerical person like the current Khamenei to succeed him, because the political expediency of somebody like Khamenei was more important than the qualifications of a Shi'i cleric to succeed Ayatollah Khomeini. So these three events have to be looked at simultaneously: the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, and Salman Rushdie. I don't know how Salman Rushdie, poor guy, feels about this, but this is how it is.
Okay, so there's two things I want to touch on there. The one is...
before we go, Ashwar, the point is, as all of these indications, there is a global reflection of these in the region around the world, but there are dire, horrible domestic consequences of it that Iranian people pay for it.
Okay, so that's a very good point. It's exactly what I sort of wanted to touch on, right? So the one is, how brutal is Khomeini's suppression, both in the aftermath of the revolution, and then it obviously sets a precedent for what goes on. I mean, we obviously get the point that, Iran's not been one monolith for the last 40 years. It's been different, but it does set a tone that kind of lasts the 40 years. So that's one thing. And how does it compare to the Shah? That's still part of the same thing. But then the second thing is, you mentioned a very interesting thing, which is, I mean, I've heard about it tangentially, but not much, about how Khomeini sort of changes it so that Khamenei, who is more sort of a lip service person and a much lower ranking person, can now take over after him. How different would the theocracy, the Iranian state, be if that change did not occur, and if a high ranking person, I think you mentioned his name is Montazeri, sort of took over? How different would that be? Maybe answer that question first, and then move on to the suppression.
Well, there are both institutional aspects and ad hominem aspects. Montazeri himself, and the key issue is the issue of velayat faqih, the supreme authority of the jurisconsult, a subject which was particularly important to Ayatollah Khomeini. He wrote a book, Hukumat Islami, Islamic government, which built on this idea of velayat faqih, which he had borrowed from earlier gestations of it, goes back to early 19th century, in which he argued that he found a hadith, a prophetic saying, that al-muluku hukkama al-nas, kings rule over men, humans. Al-muluk hukkama al-nas. Wal-ulama hukkama al-muluk. But clerics rule over the kings. So this was his theory of velayat al-faqih, and faqih, this character, faqih, the jurisconsult, has certain advanced qualifications. Now, this doctrine, to be sure, I'm just thinking my friend and comrade, Kadivar, who is an extremely progressive cleric whom I deeply admire, and he has written extensively about the fact that velayat al-faqih is not a collectively acknowledged, accepted doctrine. But for Khomeini was. So the cornerstone of velayat al-faqih, the authority of the jurisconsult, was a highest ranking learned Shi'i cleric to be in a position of that authority, which he personally occupied during his 10 years in office between 77-79 when he came back to Iran and his death in 1989. He handpicked Montazeri to succeed him. And Montazeri wrote 2-volume books, is right here in front of you, 2-volume on velayat al-faqih in Arabic, published in Lebanon, in which he consolidated the idea of velayat al-faqih for himself. But then happened the massive slaughter, mass execution of political prisoners in Tehran prisons, to which Montazeri with which disagrees and opposed it and publicized his opposition, and that angered Ayatollah Khomeini. This is happening towards the end, between 86 and 88. And this is the time when Salman Rushdie publishes his book. And this is the time that Khomeini calls for a constitutional assembly to come and redefine the qualification of Wali Faqih. That doesn't have to be a grand Ayatollah like him. It could be a lower ranking. He had Khomeini in mind. So to this day, Khomeini is fully aware that, I mean, to give you an example of a proper university thing, is for a first-year graduate student to be given the rank of a full professor. This is how it works in the Shi'i context. But he agreed with him politically, and as a result, he carried on to this day. And Montazeri was under house arrest to the end of his life.
Okay, and then coming back to the suppression, so you've touched on it there by mentioning, the fact that Khomeini Montazeri's opposition to him was over the execution, the mass execution of prisoners. But just give us a sense of just how brutal suppression has been under Khomeini, but also how does it compare with the Shah? Because there's this imagination in the eyes of the West that the Shah, was some sort of great beacon of hope relative to the theocracy. So, and then people kind of differ, and I don't want to sort of go into a contest into who's more brutal, but I think giving insights into both is interesting.
The securitization of the state under Pahlavi was vertical, meaning you had the Ministry of Intelligence, you had the secret police, etc., and you had the mass population. The securitization of the state under Khomeini was horizontal. What does that mean? In every institution, in government, in universities, in army, everywhere, he had a cell, he had a nucleus of people who were his devotees and made sure to Islamize everything. This is a period of Islamization of science and Islamization of literature, Islamization of social sciences, total gibberish. that it is also contrarian to Islamic intellectual history itself. But that's a different story. Comparing Khomeini and Shah in terms of the brutality of the regimes, I would simply say Shah was authoritarian and Khomeini was totalitarian. That's the difference. Namely, in the case of Ayatollah Khomeini, he institutionalized a totalitarian regime of a state ideology with which everybody had to agree, and he went through the entire various institutions of the society. Under his direction, you had university purges that now some of those people who actually led those university purges regretted and now trying to exonerate themselves, like Abdul Karim al-Soroush, who is a respectable person and right now is doing admirable defense of Iranian nation. But at the time, the fact is that he was manipulated by Ayatollah Khomeini, and he became part of the university purges. Those university purges, by the way, this past few months, this last year, on American campuses, this intimidation and fear that Trump has generated, fabricating the allegation of anti-Semitism, is reminiscent of those university purges that happened under Ayatollah Khomeini. So his reign, his 10 years, is defined by mass execution in prisons, university purges, cultural revolution, as he called them, and as a result, total securitization. Shah's was less successful because he was authoritarian. It was not with conviction. Khomeini's was more successful because he was totalitarian, was with religious conviction that he did it. But also keep in mind that 8 of those 10 years was also a state of war, when Iranian were defending their homeland, when the British and the French and the Americans were arming Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons in its battles against Iran. And Iran was also being fed by, if you remember the Iran-Contra incident of the 1980s, this is when the so-called arm for hostages swap happens under Reagan administration. And that period, as a result of 8 years of brutal war between Iran and Iraq, defined the terms and particularities of that securitization, that the nation was paralyzed. This is how I would compare Khomeini and Shah.
Okay, I mean, before we're gonna return back to Israel and the US in a bit, but before we go there, can you give me a sense of from sort of under Khamenei's leadership, right? What resistance and the various waves of, for lack of better words, sort of democracy movements or representative government movements have been like, and what's that evolution been like? Have there been points, in the last course where they could have been crossroads, where things could have had significant change? Just briefly, because we don't obviously have a lot of time, but just briefly, just recollect what that's been like for us.
I would identify 2 successive presidents, President Rafsanjani and President Khatami, as signposts of what happened after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. The 8-year presidency of Rafsanjani coincided with post-war reconstruction. That is, you have massive investment by the state in restructuring Iranian economy, opening the market, and so forth. So there's a period of opening of the market that generates both wealth and poverty. And this period is followed by a period of social reform under President Khatami, again for another 8 years. And then followed by 4 years of Ahmadinejad. So if we put these 3 presidents, Rafsanjani, Khatami, and Ahmadinejad together, what is happening in the society underlying this presidency is, under Rafsanjani, you have economic reconstruction, post-war economic reconstruction, generating both wealth, job opportunities, business advancement, and correspondingly poverty. When Khatami comes to power, becomes president, he starts initiating certain social reforms: freedom of the press, freedom of the assembly, cinema begins to thrive, etc., in order to cater to the needs of those middle-class beneficiaries of Rafsanjani's economic developments. Then, after him, when Ahmadinejad becomes the president, those who the poverty-stricken Iranians who were denied any advantage from those economic developments or couldn't care less about social developments were attracted to the first term of Ahmadinejad. Second term, as you recall, coincides with Mousavi and Green Movement, when there is a opening of a possibility of something of an epistemic change in Iranian political culture, that the reformist aspirations of Khatami now give rise to a much more radical demands under the period of Mir Hossein Mousavi, during which time I was very active on his behalf, and during the Green Movement. But Green Movement was brutally repressed by the ruling Islamist regime, and Ahmadinejad continued to be the president for the rest of his second term until Rouhani. Rouhani came with certain ability. He's a very smart politician, ability to both sustain the government, the ruling regime, but at the same time generate hope among the younger population. And that brings us to the Zan Zendegi Azadi, which is a demographically radically different generation that does not gel well with all of the preceding developments. I hope this somehow answers your question.
No, I mean, I think you've done. I think that's a separate episode in entirety. So, I mean, I appreciate the brevity. Before we get back to the current crisis, I just have one more thing, and I want you to kind of explain this phenomenon, right? That occurs. I mean, the thing is, I think most people who interact with Iranians outside of Iran probably have come across this phenomenon, and you've described it in your article as the following. They will also come after the Pahlavi family and the new breed of native informers popping up in the U.S. to demean their homeland and cheer for Israel. So I think there may be people who are lost here, but I'm sure many people have interacted with an Iranian who seems to really love the Shah, love Israel, and consistently berates their own sort of Iranian, homeland in a way, but at the same time is strangely proudly Iranian. How did this sort of species come into existence?
Those who read me, I have a book. It's called Brown Skin, White Mask. Fanon wrote a big, magnificent book, Black Skin, White Mask. Mine is called Brown Skin, White Masks. It's a particularly American phenomenon, but it is also European phenomenon. The origin of it actually goes back to India, to Macaulay Act. Macaulay famously said, "We need a generation of Indians," I'm quoting him almost verbatim, "that look Indian outside, but think British inside." We have that phenomenon among Iranians, among Arabs, etc. Anytime there is a moment of crisis with Iraq, with Kuwait, and with Iran, suddenly the reactionary joints and publications and media finds these creatures around who come and advocate and corroborate. Kanan Makia was a famous case during the U.S. invasion of Iraq. What happens in the case of these native informers, and I have written on them extensively, Azar Nafisi is another one, the Reading Lolita thingamajig. What happens with them? They have legitimate concerns with the ruling Islamist regime. Perfectly, women's rights, democratic aspirations, they're perfectly legitimate. But they cross-border, come here, and put those legitimate concerns to illegitimate justification of American imperial designs. This is where the thing happened. For example, during the U.S. invasion of Kuwait, suddenly a child appeared on American televisions that said, "Oh yes, babies are killed in the Saddam Hussein kills babies in the incubators and so forth." Later turned out that this was the product of a PR firm in New York, and this girl was the child of a Kuwaiti ambassador. You have all of at the same time, the book Reading Lolita in Tehran came out at the same time. I have written on this. The Israelis just turned it into a movie produced in Israel and God knows where. I'm not, in fact, what I am concerned with is how they put legitimate concerns, legitimate aspirations of an entire nation, turn it into mechanism of support for this imperial designs. The case of the Pahlavis is particularly pathological. They are creating this image of the Pahlavi period that I am a product of it, that it was God's gift to humanity, and they show pictures of young Iranian women in miniskirts as if that's supposed to mean anything. You could be in miniskirts and an entirely reactionary, useless human being, and you can be perfectly legitimate person and active and healthy and self-reliant, or in terms of any other form of public appearance in terms of your choice of dress. But these monarchies are particularly, first of all, there's a strong element of Islamophobia in them. They detest Islamic Republic, perhaps sometimes for right reasons, but they degenerate into hatred of Islam as a religion, as a culture, as a civilization. So and that then they participate in Islamophobia that is rampant in United States, and Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu are partaking in that particular pathology. They are not that popular. In terms of number, they're insignificant. But the reason that they need to be attended to and discredited is that the media, Western media in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, gives them a space, invites them to conferences. For example, during the Zan Zendegi Azadi uprising, a grassroots event inside Iran, led by Iranian women, then suddenly this creature, Masih Ali-Nejad, shows up, and she said, "I'm the leader of Zan Zendegi Azadi uprising." She was none of anything of that sort. But she was a product, as I told an American news journalist. She was an American phenomenon. We have to understand these people are American. They are part and parcel of American ideological frame of references. Their names are Arash and Masume and such. They partake in those names. But the fact is that they are part of the ideological apparatus at work to justify and legitimize U.S. warmongering in the region.
Okay, final question. It's got two branches, right? So we'll deal with the first branch, which is more sort of Iranian. So you've mentioned a few times in this interview how interventions occurrences from the Rushdie affair to the Iran-Iraq war to the Contra scandal to a bunch of others, how they derail the organic process of that Iranian society is going through, right? So just first, limited to Iran, how is this intervention, and you've kind of touched on it already, right, that yes, now the nation will sort of, it will accelerate Iran's desire to get a nuclear war, but that's on a governmental level. It will also have societal effects. So how will this Israeli and US attack, which is still unfolding, and we don't know what's going to occur, we don't know if it's going to get more hectic or whether it will be stepped down, whether it will escalate, but how is that going to sort of derail the current organic process that Iranian society is going through to become, to work towards a more developed society which is more politically representative?
Sure. What you need to notice, if you detect a certain agitation in me, the fact is that the Israeli design for Iran is identical with the Israeli design for Lebanon, for Syria. They don't want a country of this size with 100 million population, some of the most sophisticated younger generation, to be there in their neighborhood. They have been arming and supporting, militarizing separatist movements in Kurdistan, in Baluchistan. People in Kurdistan and Baluchistan, again, as you see, I have to constantly navigate. They have perfectly legitimate concerns and complaints against the central government. If you look at the Baluch, for example, in Pakistan, they also have legitimate concerns and grievances against the Pakistani central government. But what Israel has done, particularly with the Kurds, is arm them, train them. And there are also even suggestions that these drones that they say they were manufactured inside Iran, they were smuggled into Iran by some elements within the Kurdish separatist movements. Their design is absolutely not for regime change, for Iran to remain intact within its current borders, with 95 to 100 million population, robust population, young generation, ambitious generation, intact and independent and participating in world affairs. This is not what they want. This attack, this design is against the entirety of Iranian society, Iranian nation, Iran as a country. They want to dismantle it. They want to fragment it. They want to create something in Azerbaijan, something in Kurdistan. So this is not conspiracy. They come out and they say it outright, that this is too big. This country is too big. So this agitation is people like me. All my life, I cannot set foot in my own country without going directly to jail. I have advocated for equal rights, for women's rights, gay, lesbian rights, every right that is definitive to a contemporary society, but not at the expense of dismantling that country. Two women who received legitimately and rightly Nobel Prize, Narges Mohammadi and Shirin Ebadi. Right now, they don't understand in their statements. The whole country is in danger. They are Iranians. There must be an Iran for you to be an Iranian. And as a result, in their writing, they're more condemning the ruling regime, which has every reason to be condemned, than they are of Israel. They don't even pay attention to what the Israeli design is. Israel is bombing. In my one of my interviews I recently wrote, I forget, I've given so many. Yours I don't confuse with others because is more sustained and is more casual. I said, I rather see Iran under the tyranny of Islamic Republic rather than the bombs of Israel. The reason is I believe in the organic change and organic development against mismanagement, against corruption that is rampant in Islamic Republic. The issue is for us to think and read and write for territorial integrity of all the current post-colonial states. Lebanon, Syria. Look at what Israel did to Syria. Syria no longer exists. They destroyed the military infrastructure of Syria. They have taken not just the Golan Heights, adjacent to Golan Heights. They have created an area for the Druze, an area for the thing. I am against ethnic nationalism. Any kind of ethnic nationalism is a disaster. Ethnic nationalism. They all have to come together to form a pluralistic society that they inform each other. This has not happened, but should happen. And the last entity on planet Earth who could speak it is a Jewish state that cannot even tolerate its own Palestinian and call them Israeli Arabs. So you imagine, these are Palestinians trapped in their own homeland and they're called Israeli Arabs. What is to be done? These demands, democratic demands, rights of equality, women's rights, human rights, ought to be achieved organically, not under the bombs. No bombs will bring no democracy anywhere.
Okay, so you've kind of touched on what was going to be the second part of the final question, which is the colonial playbook, right? And we saw this probably most grotesquely carried out in Africa during the slave trade, and millions of people killed, millions of Africans armed in the 18th and 17th centuries to get slaves for the slave trade, and did we really it was. I mean, colonialism was horrid in all its forms in many places, but it's possibly among its grotesque forms. And in the last 100 years, in sort of the neo-colonial period, it almost seems like that playbook is in overdrive again, specifically in the area of land from Algeria to Iran, right? We've seen war after war, intervention after intervention. And you're right. I mean, absolutely. I completely agree with your analysis that often it's about democratize. The word is we coming to democratize, we're getting rid of a regime, or we going to disarm a WMD or a nuclear weapon. But really, in essence, these are wars against the people's societies. It's wars to fragment. It's wars to weaken infrastructure. It's wars to create chaos, to sow ethnic conflict, to put people against each other. And I mean, and obviously this is usually accompanied by, the employment of client regimes and the propping up of client regimes. And this is, I mean, if this is evidently clear now, and if it wasn't evidently, I mean, I don't think there's been a moment, in the post-World War II era where we can now see clearly, because there's been example after example where this is occurring. What is your how is this going to have blowback? Do you think there will be blowback and it will somehow weaken the US and Israel? I mean, because fundamentally, while it does tactically lead them to losses, the fundamental society that are victimized by all of this are the local societies. Just what's your comment on that? How is blowback going to work? How bad can this get? And how do you see this unfolding as young populations throughout the region get smarter, get wiser, and get more frustrated?
My estimation, Ashfaq, is as follows: that for United States to bring democracy, itself has to be a beacon of democracy. Right now, certainly during the last few months that Trump is the president, if you follow the local news in the United States, everybody and their cousins is absolutely convinced that this is the end of American democracy, that the overreach of the executive branch under Trump has put the entire legal system, has put the legislative system under pressure. And he's doing, for example, right now, there are demands within the Congress to impeach Trump because of this military strike, because it was unauthorized. It was just endangering American military in a region without authorization from the Congress, which means an overreach of the executive branch over the legislative branch. So you have fundamental, he threatens and bullies law firms and demands and exacts for them to do work for him for free. He is withholding allocation of funding to university that the Congress has approved. He has no authority to suspend those, as you see it in the case of Harvard, to suspend those allocations of federal funding. But he does it. He has weaponized Title VI. Not only he, the Zionists working for him have weaponized Title VI, which was one of the most glorious achievements of the civil rights movement, to silence, intimidate, and frighten a group of students who camp and oppose genocide. Half of the leadership are actually Jewish students, and you accuse Jewish students of being anti-Semitic. I mean, look the stupidity and the chutzpah of that. You go and tell Jewish leadership of a student uprising that you are anti-Semitic, that this movement is anti-Semitic. But it is not just them. New York Times is chiefly responsible for demonizing this student movement. My point is that the issue of democracy is already in trouble within the United States. Just look how many caring, competent people who care about democracy in their country constantly are warning against what is happening under Trump administration. And as soon as you say that, for example, right now, there are people who are saying, okay, you oppose that Donald Trump, without authorization, engage in a military action in Iran. But he's not the first one to do it. Obama did it. Bush did it, etc., etc. So there is something constitutionally flawed in this apparatus, in this situation. If United States itself is ruled by a massive demagogue, by a convicted felon who should be in jail but is actually in White House, then they bring democracy to where? Israel bring democracy to what? Israel cannot give democracy to its own Palestinian citizens who are there. Palestinians are suffering through secondary citizenship in their own political system within Israel. And Israel can bring democracy to any country? Of course they can. It's a joke. And they know it's a joke. But they say it, and New York Times does not even blink, talking about, oh yes, Iranian nuclear ambition. What about Israeli nuclear fact? Forget about ambition. The fact that they stole from hook and crook and created a nuclear, and is a threat. And it is not that they don't threat. They have constantly threatened Iran with nuclear annihilation. Systematically, consistently, repeatedly, Israeli officials have threatened Iran with nuclear in a thinly veiled kind of a language. So, do we need democracy around the world, in Egypt, in Pakistan, in India, in Iran, Turkey? Of course we do. Right now, when Trump came to power, they're constantly looking at Turkey, looking at Egypt for models. I said, excuse me, you can look at Germany of Hitler, you can look at Italy of Mussolini, you can look at Spain of Franco as models. Don't keep going to Oriental places to find somebody to see what is happening. This is coming directly from the heart of American democracy against democracy. So, fortunately, for me, is a moment of liberation. Thank God we don't have any illusion about any country being a paragon of hope for democracy. We are, as I repeatedly say, on our own. So, first thing we do, we tell Trump, oh, you want a regime change? How about if we have regime change in the United States? Let's have a regime change in the United States. That's number one. Number two, the Netanyahu, you want to bring democracy to Iran? How about if we bring democracy to occupied Palestine? Let's do that. So you puncture their lives. But just puncturing their lives is not sufficient. We're talking about masses of millions of human beings on a fragile planet in desperation for the most ordinary and the most basic needs of life. They need attending to. That needs a global context. 850 million human beings roam around the globe hungry, in search of food. So these Mexican or Latinos that are trying to come to the United States is not for the good weather in the United States. They're in search of job. Those strawberries need to be picked and tomatoes need to be picked. What is happening, all of these rules and regulations about legal immigration and so forth, because those immigrants will come, cheap labor will come to the United States. They're just imposing these rules and terrorizing their lives by ICE in order to keep them under the radar so they won't unionize, they don't demand minimum wage, their labor abuse. There is no model for democracy. The world is on its own, and the world will, Iranians will, Egyptians, Pakistanis, Turks, etc., they will eventually, from the depth and heart and the roots of their historical experiences, manage a kind of sovereignty of nations that will never accept either the lie of US, Israel bringing democracy, or accept the tyranny that rules over them. Of course, Erdogan is not God's gift to democracy. Of course, the military junta in Pakistan or in Egypt or the mullahs in Iran, of course they need to be changed, but they need to be changed organically by their own people, eventually, as they search for the possibility of a democratic way of thinking, just and democratic way of thinking, in order to make life possible. What is the model of it? Absolutely Palestinians. Look at Palestine, look at Palestinians, and look how they have preserved their humanity, their integrity, their moral rectitude under such brutal period, and still they demand and they will exact their freedom. That, to me, is the model for the rest of humanity.
Professor Hamid Dabashi, thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful and pleasurable and a bit of a gloomy conversation considering the circumstances. But thank you for your time, and we wish you best of luck.
If you look back, probably I had occasionally smile. So.
Awesome, excellent. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, man. Good chatting with you, Ashfaq. Be well.
Good chatting with you as well. Keep well, Professor Dabashi.
Take care.
See you. Bye-bye.